It started like any ordinary day, until it turned into a nightmare. A mother, alone and vulnerable, trapped under the weight of power gone unchecked. A crowd watching, torn between fear and fury, and then a voice deep and commanding, cut through the chaos like a blade. "Get your hands off my mother." In that moment, everything changed. What happened next? No one was ready for it, but the world was about to witness a reckoning. Imagine watching a cop shove your father so hard he crashes into the pavement, his head bouncing off the cold concrete. Now imagine being the one person who could end that cop's entire career with a single decision. It was supposed to be just another evening at Crestwood Mall, the kind of place where exhausted parents dragged their kids from store to store, where teenagers loitered around neon-lit food courts, and where holiday sale signs lured in weary shoppers. The air smelled of cinnamon pretzels and fresh coffee, a comforting contrast to the tension about to unfold. Among the crowd was Evelyn Carter, 72 years old, a retired school teacher with silver-streaked curls tucked beneath a burgundy scarf. She moved with the quiet confidence of someone who had spent a lifetime commanding respect, not through force but through wisdom. She wasn't looking for trouble, just a simple trip to pick up a birthday gift for her grandson. But fate had other plans. She had just stepped out of Macy's when she heard it. Raised voices, sharp, edged with frustration. A few feet away, near the checkout at an electronics store, a young man stood rigid, his fists clenching and unclenching at his sides. He couldn't have been older than 23, his hoodie slightly oversized, his sneakers worn but clean. Across from him, a middle-aged cashier glanced nervously toward the store's entrance, her fingers hovering near the register like she wanted to back away, but wasn't sure if she should. "I'm telling you, the money's there," the young man insisted, his voice tight. "Run the card again." "I can't," the cashier stammered. "Store policy. If it declines once." "It didn't decline," he interrupted. "It's a brand new card. I just activated it." The tension crackled between them, thick enough to choke on. Nearby customers slowed their steps, sensing something about to boil over but pretending they didn't. That's how these things always started. Small, until they weren't. Evelyn knew the signs. The fear in the cashier's darting eyes. The frustration in the boy's rigid stance. And then worse, the arrival of mall security. A tall officer with a shaved head and a jaw set like stone was already moving in. His uniform stretched tight across his chest, the radio on his belt crackling with static. He didn't hesitate. He didn't ask questions. He reached out and grabbed the young man's wrist. "Sir, I'm going to have to ask you to step outside." The boy jerked back instinctively, eyes flaring with panic. "What? I didn't do anything." "You're causing a disturbance." "I'm just trying to buy a damn phone." The officer didn't care. His grip tightened. The moment stretched. 1 second. 2. And then, the shove. Hard. Unnecessary. The young man stumbled backward, his heel catching the edge of a display shelf. He went down, crashing into a rack of headphones that clattered to the floor. A sharp gasp rippled through the store. Someone pulled out their phone. Someone else whispered, "Oh my God." And Evelyn Carter, she took a step forward, because she had a choice: walk away like everyone else, or be the one person who refused to let injustice slip quietly into the shadows. The security guard stepped forward, his presence meant to de-escalate, but before he could say a word, a new voice sliced through the tension, cold, sharp, absolute. "Step away, now." Officer Graves had arrived, but Evelyn Carter knew, even before she turned, that he wasn't here to listen. His reputation preceded him, the kind of cop who didn't ask questions, he decided. And once he did, nothing changed his mind. A man who believed authority wasn't earned but imposed, and the weight of his badge was an excuse to press down harder. His presence alone sent a ripple through the crowd, a silent signal that this situation was no longer just about a disputed transaction. It was about power. His gaze locked onto Evelyn, like a predator sizing up its prey. "Ma'am, I said move." She blinked, confused. "I was just trying to..." "Did I stutter?" He stepped closer, the air around him charged with the kind of aggression that made people shrink. But Evelyn Carter had never been the kind to shrink. The boy at the counter, tense, breathing fast, shook his head. She didn't do anything. Graves ignored him completely. Last chance, lady. Evelyn didn't move, didn't flinch. Maybe it was age. Maybe it was knowing that men like Graves had been making the same threats her whole life. Maybe it was simply the realization that fear had long stopped serving her. I'm not interfering, she said, steady as stone. I'm making sure no one gets hurt over something that doesn't matter. Something flickered in Graves's expression, not hesitation, annoyance. He wasn't used to being questioned, least of all by someone who had no fear of him. His nostrils flared. He stepped even closer, towering over her, his hand resting near his belt. I don't need a speech. I gave you an order. The security guard shifted uncomfortably. The cashier swallowed hard. The boy at the register clenched his fists. And the crowd watched, some with phones half raised, others whispering in anticipation, waiting to see what would happen next. Evelyn exhaled slowly, raising her hands in a show of compliance. All right, no need to be aggressive, officer. She turned to walk away, but Graves wasn't finished. Stop. She turned back, her brows furrowed. I'm leaving. Graves shook his head. Not so fast. He pulled out his notepad, flipping it open with deliberate slowness, like he was already drafting her fate. Name. Evelyn's frown deepened. Why? He smirked. Because I'm citing you for obstruction. The murmurs in the crowd grew louder. Someone whispered, "You've got to be kidding me." Another voice, barely above a breath, muttered, "This is ridiculous." Phones were fully up now, recording every second. The weight of a dozen lenses pressed into Graves' back, but he didn't care. He never did. Evelyn held his gaze. "Officer, I was only trying to de-escalate." "I don't care," he cut in. "ID. Now." Something in his tone made it clear. This wasn't about rules, it was about control. And suddenly, Evelyn understood. This moment, it wasn't about her words, it wasn't even about the boy at the counter. It was about whether she was willing to be silenced. The moment stretched thin, suffocating, as Officer Graves' eyes darkened with something dangerous, something Evelyn Carter had seen before in men who wielded power like a weapon, not a responsibility. His hand hovered near his belt, fingers twitching, not for his gun but for something just as dangerous. His radio. "Dispatch," he said, pressing the button with slow deliberation. "I have a non-compliant suspect at the Foot Locker, requesting backup." Suspect. The word cut through the air like a knife, sharp enough to make Evelyn's stomach turn. Murmurs rippled through the growing crowd, confusion laced with disbelief. The boy at the counter took a step forward, eyes blazing. "Man, what?" "She didn't do anything." Graves didn't so much as glance at him. His focus never left Evelyn, his voice dipping to a chilling monotone. "Last chance, give me your ID, or I will be forced to detain you." Evelyn didn't move. The silence stretched between them, thick and suffocating. A younger version of herself might have fought back with words, tried to reason with him, but she knew better. She had seen this story play out too many times before. So slow and deliberate, she reached for her purse, fingers brushing against her wallet. The crowd held its breath. And then, a shove, hard, sudden. His hand slammed into her shoulder with force meant to unbalance, meant to send a message. She staggered backward, her arm catching against the edge of a clothing rack. Gasps erupted around her. A woman's voice cut through the tension. "Yo, what the hell?" Evelyn's breath hitched, a sharp pain blooming across her arm where she had caught herself. She blinked up at him, disbelief washing over her. But Graves, he wasn't finished. His breathing had changed, shallower, faster, like a man teetering on the edge of control. His fingers twitched closer to his cuffs, his expression carved from something ugly and unrelenting. The mall felt different now, no longer a place of shopping and idle distractions. It had become something else, a battleground, and the people, they weren't just watching anymore. They were waiting to see if this would become one of those moments, the kind that made headlines, that flooded social media with shaky phone footage. that turned into another name, another tragedy, another question of how things had gone so terribly wrong. And Graves didn't disappoint. Something inside him snapped, patience stretched too thin, his control slipping like sand through clenched fists. His arm shot forward, fast, too fast, a blur of motion, a crack of bone against flesh. His fist connected with Evelyn's face. The sound of impact was sickening, a sharp, brutal collision that sent a shockwave through the store. Her head jerked to the side, a flash of white-hot pain exploding behind her eyes. For a moment the world tilted, disoriented and unreal, and then her legs gave out. The floor rushed up to meet her, cold tile pressing against her skin. The pain settled in, dull at first, then searing, radiating from her cheek, down her jaw, deep into her bones. Gasps turned to screams. A woman's voice, frantic. Oh my God. A man's voice, furious. Did he just punch her? More voices, overlapping, frantic, rising into chaos. Evelyn's hands trembled as she lifted them to her face, fingers brushing against her throbbing cheek, warmth blooming under her touch. Blood, maybe. Her vision swam, figures shifting, moving, some stepping closer, others frozen in place. And Graves, he stood over her, his expression unreadable. But she saw it. The moment he realized, the moment he understood that he had gone too far, the moment he knew there was no coming back from this. Phones were out, cameras were rolling, the world was watching, and Evelyn Carter, lying on that cold mall floor, understood something too. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The floor was cold beneath Evelyn Carter's cheek, the sting in her face radiating through her skull. Her glasses lay somewhere to her left, forgotten in the chaos, but she had no time to process the sharp throbbing pain blooming along her jaw, no time to collect herself, because before she could even take a breath, Officer Graves was on her. A crushing weight slammed onto her back, forcing the air from her lungs in a painful gasp. His hands, rough and unrelenting, latched onto her arms. "Stop resisting," he barked. Resisting. She was barely conscious. The crowd surged now, shifting from stunned silence to outrage. The voices around her blurred into a cacophony of anger, disbelief, and fear. "Get off her," a man shouted. Phone held high. A woman's voice broke, trembling with emotion. "She's an old lady. What are you doing?" The boy from the register, the one who had been caught in all of this from the beginning, pushed forward, his face flushed with rage. "Man, what the hell is wrong with you?" But Graves, he didn't care. His grip tightened around Evelyn's wrist, twisting it behind her back with practiced force, a mechanical movement, a movement meant to punish, to make an example of. His knee dug into the space between her shoulders, pinning her to the floor. He reached for his cuffs, ready to snap them around her wrists, and then a voice cut through the madness, deep, commanding, unmistakable. "Get your hands off my mother." The shift was immediate, like a wire pulled taut and suddenly severed. The chaos in the store froze, voices died in their throats, and for the first time that day, something flickered across Officer Graves' face: hesitation. His grip loosened just slightly, not much, but enough. The crowd parted, instinctive, like water retreating before a storm, and the storm stepped forward. Malcolm Carter, tall, broad shoulders, cutting a formidable silhouette against the store's bright fluorescent lights, a suit so impeccably tailored, it looked as though it had been sewn onto his body. But it wasn't the expensive fabric or the sharp cut of his jaw that made the room shrink around him. It was his presence. Behind him 2 men followed, just as sharply dressed, just as unreadable. Graves didn't know them, but the crowd did. Recognition flickered through the murmurs, shifting the energy of the store from outrage to something else. Anticipation. And that was when the first sliver of fear slid into Graves' eyes. But Malcolm, he wasn't looking at him. He was looking at her. His mother, lying bruised on the floor, struggling to breathe beneath the weight of a man who had no business touching her. His jaw clenched, a muscle feathering in his cheek. His hands curled into fists, but his voice, it didn't rise. It didn't need to. I said, Malcolm repeated, each syllable slow, controlled, lethal. Get your hands off my mother. Graves blinked, recalibrating, grasping at the last tendrils of his arrogance. He hated being challenged, hated feeling out of control. She resisted arrest. He spat, fingers tightening around Evelyn's wrist, a desperate attempt to hold on to the power he had already lost. Malcolm took another step forward, and that's when Graves realized just how tall he was. But Malcolm didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to, because in that moment, Officer Graves understood something. He had just made the worst mistake of his life. Graves' fingers twitched, but he didn't move. Malcolm Carter's voice was like steel wrapped in velvet, low, unshaken, laced with the kind of quiet power that made lesser men nervous. Let her go. The weight of the words landed heavier than Graves had expected. He hesitated, but not because he wanted to, because something in his gut told him this wasn't just another civilian he could steamroll over. His grip remained firm on Evelyn Carter's wrist, his pride unwilling to release her so easily. And then one of the men behind Malcolm stepped forward. This is the part where you stop digging your own grave. Officer Graves. The voice was even controlled. No anger, just certainty. That was what made it terrifying. Graves turned his head sharply, eyes locking onto the man. He was calm, too calm, and before Graves could sneer out a response, the man reached into his suit and pulled out a badge. The small metallic emblem caught the overhead lights, sending a cold glint through the air. DCJ, Civil Rights Division. Graves' stomach plummeted. This wasn't just a PR nightmare. This was career-ending. For the first time, real fear trickled down his spine. But still, his pride refused to let him fold. His fingers slackened on Evelyn's wrist, but not enough to let go. His jaw worked, his brain spinning through his options, trying to find an out. Could he talk his way out of this? Could he spin the story before it got out of control? But Malcolm had already moved past him. He crouched beside his mother, his presence eclipsing Graves entirely, like the officer no longer existed. He didn't waste a single glance on the man who had brutalized her. Instead, his focus was on her and her alone. Mom, soft, gentle, a world apart from the quiet fury simmering beneath his skin. Evelyn Carter winced, her cheek already swelling, her breaths uneven. I'm okay, baby, she whispered, but she wasn't. Everyone in that store could see she wasn't. Malcolm's fists clenched, his entire body tensed, but he didn't lash out. He didn't need to, because the DCJ agent wasn't done. Officer Graves, the man said again, his voice sharper this time, step away from her. Now the unspoken warning was clear. There would be no second command. Graves' grip finally loosened, fingers peeling away like dead weight. His knee lifted off Evelyn's back, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, she could breathe. Malcolm slipped an arm around his mother, helping her sit up with a touch so gentle, it made the brutality of what had just happened all the more stark. The silence in the store was deafening. Every single person held their breath, waiting for what came next. Graves stood there, rigid eyes darting around, the cameras, the stares, the weight of what he had just done pressing down on him like a vice. And then Graves' voice broke through the silence. His partner, Officer Blake, had been standing nearby, watching everything unfold. Until now she had been frozen in stunned disbelief. But not anymore. She stepped forward, her face pale, her voice tight with something between horror and fury. What the hell did you just do? Graves glared at her, daring her to challenge him. But Blake wasn't backing him up. Not this time, because even she knew this wasn't defendable. One of the DCJ officials turned to Malcolm, his tone laced with finality. We saw everything, he said, and we've already contacted internal affairs. Your mother will get justice. Graves' breath hitched. His entire career flashed before his eyes. The lawsuits, the investigations, the headlines, and for the first time in his life, he realized he had already lost. Graves' breath was shallow, his pulse a drumbeat against his skull, but the worst part wasn't the weight of his own actions pressing down on him. It was the fact that his face, His mistake was now everywhere. The internet was ruthless, and even as his hands twitched at his sides, as sweat prickled at the back of his neck, he knew there was no escaping this. His name, his badge number, his disgrace, permanently etched into the digital world for millions to see. But it wasn't over yet, because Malcolm Carter wasn't finished. Slowly, methodically, Malcolm rose to his full height, adjusting the cuff of his pristine suit like he had all the time in the world. His expression was unreadable, his movements calculated, but when he finally spoke, the air in the mall thickened, like a storm about to break. Justice, Malcolm mused, rolling the word on his tongue like it was something foreign, something insufficient. Then his gaze locked onto Graves with an intensity that turned the officer's stomach. No, this isn't just about justice. This is about making sure you never do this to anyone else again. And that was when Graves knew his life was never going to be the same. The crowd, once whispering, now roared with energy. Phones remained steady in their hands, capturing everything, broadcasting it live. This wasn't just a bad moment for Graves. This was his end. Every second that ticked by cemented his downfall further, every camera lens burning into him, like the red-hot brand of consequence. Evelyn Carter, battered but unbroken, was finally helped to her feet. She wavered, body unsteady, but her eyes held the strength of a woman who had survived more than men, like Graves could comprehend. She had seen the worst of history, and still stood. And now, history would witness this. Malcolm took another step forward, his voice quieter this time, but no less lethal. You thought she was just another old black woman you could intimidate. The words slithered into the silence, sharp and deliberate. You didn't think twice before putting your hands on her, because you've done this before, because you've gotten away with it before. Graves' throat bobbed, his lips parted, but nothing came out. What could he say? Malcolm leaned in, the final nail in the coffin already poised. But this time, he said, you picked the wrong one. A pause. This time you were caught. The DOJ official turned then, eyes shifting to Officer Blake, who had remained frozen, watching her partner unravel. Officer Blake. The man's voice was crisp. Official, take his badge. Now. Blake hesitated. She had worked alongside Graves for years, shared shifts, shared meals, shared conversations about life outside the badge. But now, as she looked at him, she didn't see a man she trusted. She didn't see a fellow officer. She saw a coward. Without a word she reached forward and unclipped his badge. Graves flinched, as if she had ripped something vital from his very flesh. His mouth opened, a desperate last attempt to salvage the unsalvageable. But no words came. It was over. Mal's security closed in, escorting him away. Not in cuffs, not yet. But it didn't matter, because this was only the beginning of his downfall. By the time Evelyn Carter was seated in the ambulance, Malcolm at her side, the video had already spread like wildfire. CNN, MSNBC, Twitter,